Eleanor Ashford, 48 and 2 years a widow, set a warm loaf on the iron gate of a man who hadn't spoken to a living soul in 3 years. One seeded loaf, a cold gate, the vast, silent hall behind it. The whole village of Nettlefold watched and murmured, and the Duke's own nephew sneered it aloud, right there before the 15 souls at the churchyard wall. "A baker's widow, feeding the Duke of Aldermere like a stray. Have you no shame, woman?" Then, on the 9th dawn, the gate stood open, the grey shape of the Duke waiting in it, something in his hand he had never shown anyone. If you believe it's never too late for the heart, this story is for you. Subscribe before we begin, and comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far Eleanor's bread travels. There is a morning, later in this story, when an old man will stand close enough to touch a woman's hand and refuse to. He will say 7 quiet words that break them both. "Were I 10 years younger, you'd be my Duchess." He will mean it as a mercy. It will land as a wound. But that morning is a long way off, and to understand how a duke came to say such a thing to a baker's widow, you have to go back. Back to the cold, back to the bread, back to a village called Nettlefold in the West Riding of Yorkshire in the autumn of 1874. Eleanor Ashford woke before the bells, as she had every day of her married life. The room was black and cold. She lay a moment under the weight of the quilt and listened to the house. It made the same small sounds it always had, the settle of old timber, the tick of the range downstairs, gone cold overnight, the wind finding the gap under the shop door. Once those sounds had a man's breathing threaded through them. Now there was only her. She rose. She dressed in the dark by feel, the way she had learned to, so as not to wake a husband who no longer needed waking. Thomas Ashford had been the baker of Nettlefold for 26 years. He had been her husband for 24 of them. 2 winters passed, a fever took him in 9 days. She had buried him in the churchyard behind St. Aldhelm's, under a stone she paid for herself, and then she had come home and opened the shop the very next morning. People said she was hard for it. People were wrong. She opened the shop because the shop was all she had left of him. His flour, his scales, the long deal counter worn pale where his forearms had rested. To stop would have been to bury him twice. She went down the narrow stair. She riddled the range and fed it and coaxed the fire back into life. That was the first prayer of her day. Fire, then flour, then work. She tied her apron. She lit the tallow dip and set it on the shelf. And then, without thinking, out of a habit so old her hands did it while her mind was elsewhere, she took down 2 cups from the dresser. 2. One for her. One for the man who used to stand at the bench beside her and drink his tea scalding while the first batch proved. She stood there a moment with a cup in each hand. Then she put one back on its hook. She did it gently. She did not sigh. She had learned that a sigh, once you let it start, could take the whole morning from you. So she simply put the cup back and made the tea for one, and drank it standing, looking at the dark window, at her own dim shape held in the glass. Outside, the village slept. Nettlefold was a poor, decent, stone-built place. A church, an inn, a smithy, a green. 2 rows of houses that leaned toward one another over a lane so narrow a cart filled it. Perhaps 300 souls, all told, who knew one another's business the way you know the back of your own hand. And above them all, on the ridge that closed the valley to the north, stood Aldermere Hall. You could see it from the shop door if you stepped out and looked up. A great grey house against a greater grey sky. It had been the seat of the Dukes of Aldermere for 200 years. In Eleanor's girlhood, it had blazed with light on winter nights, and carriages had come up the long drive, and the village had lived half on the money that flowed down from it. Now it stood dark, every shutter closed, the garden gone to briar and nettle, the gates chained. 3 years it had been so. 3 years since the Duke had shut himself inside it and stopped being a man the world could see. They said he was mad up there. They said he was dying. They said he sat all day in a room he would not let anyone dust, with his dead wife's chair beside his own. Ambrose Thorne, 6th Duke of Aldermere. He had buried his Duchess Beatrice, of a wasting sickness, and within the same 12-month he had buried his only son, Edmund, thrown from a horse on the Harrogate road at 23. First the wife, then the boy, and after that the Duke had simply closed the door. He dismissed all but 2 old servants. He answered no letters. He received no callers. He walked, when he walked at all, in the dark, so that the only proof he still lived was a lamp that moved sometimes behind an upstairs shutter. That was the man on the ridge, and this was the woman in the shop, and you should hold them both in your mind now, at their proper distance, before anyone in this story is fool enough to judge them. A widow who gave without letting herself be seen. A widower who saw no one at all. The whole valley between them. It began on a Tuesday in freezing rain. Eleanor had a delivery to make to old Mistress Pratt, whose knees would no longer carry her down the hill. The quickest way was the ridge lane, past the very gates of the hall. She went with her basket covered against the wet, a shawl pulled over her head, her boots dark to the ankle. The rain came sideways off the moor. It was the kind of cold that gets into the teeth. And there, at the great iron gates of Aldermere, she saw him. She knew him at once, though she had not laid eyes on him in years. A tall man, stooped now, grey, bare-headed in the downpour, no coat against the weather. He stood on the inside of his own chained gate, with his hands wrapped around the wet iron bars, and he was looking out. Down the empty lane, at nothing, at the rain. He did not move when she came near. He did not seem to know she was there at all. He stood in his ruined garden, at the gate of his own great house, and he looked for all the world like a man who had been locked out of his life and could not remember the way back in. Eleanor slowed. She did not speak. What was there to say to a duke in the rain? She was a baker's widow with a basket. There were 100 years of custom between her mouth and his ear. So she said nothing. She only looked, for the space of 3 breaths, at the sorrow of him. And then she went on up the hill and made her delivery and came home. And she could not put the sight of him out of her mind all that day. A man ought not to stand in the cold like that. A man ought to be fed. That was all it was at the start. Not love, not even kindness quite, in the way she'd have named it. Only the plain, stubborn conviction of a woman who had spent her whole life feeding people, that a body standing bareheaded in the rain, with no light in its eyes, was a body that wanted warm bread. So the next morning, before the bells, she baked an extra loaf. It was her seeded plat, a good loaf, dark and close, plaited over and scattered with seeds that caught in your teeth and tasted of the fields. She wrapped it in a clean white cloth while it was still warm enough to steam, and in the grey before dawn, before the village stirred, she walked up the ridge lane alone. She came to the chained gates of Aldermere. She reached through the cold iron and set the warm loaf on the flat of the gatepost, in under the arch where the rain would not reach it. And then she turned and walked back down the hill, and she did not look behind her once. She told no one, she did not knock, she did not wait to be thanked. She left the bread on the gate, the way you leave milk for a cat that will not let you near it, and she went home and opened her shop. The loaf was gone by afternoon. She did not know who took it. A servant, most like. Perhaps the birds. It did not matter. The next morning she baked another, and left it just the same. And the morning after that. It became a thing her hands did, the way they had once reached for 2 cups. A small warmth carried up a cold hill and left at a locked gate for a man who would never see her do it. Now, I want you to hear something that Eleanor said around this time, because she said it so lightly that she forgot it the moment it left her mouth. And yet, it is the whole secret of this story, hidden in plain daylight over a shop counter. A woman named Sarah Cobb came in for her Friday order and admired the seeded plat, as customers did, and asked how Eleanor came by such a receipt, for she'd tasted none like it in the riding. And Eleanor, weighing flour, not even looking up, said, "Oh, it's not mine, that one. A great lady taught it me, years back, when I was a girl in service up at the hall one summer. I've made it ever since." That was all. A great lady, up at the hall, one summer. Sarah Cobb nodded and paid and went out, and neither of them thought of it again. But you should think of it. Keep it somewhere safe, at the back of your mind, and I will tell you when to take it out. For now the bread went up the hill, and the world began to talk. It could not help but talk. Nettlefold was small, and a small place watches everything. Eyes at windows saw the baker's widow climb the ridge lane at dawn. Tongues in the inn made it into something. A woman, alone, going up to the mad Duke's gate before light. It was not decent, they said. What was she after? A Duke's fortune? A Duke's favour? Had she no sense of her place? The vicar, Reverend Cade, a kind and cautious man, heard the murmurs and worried at them. He liked Eleanor. He also liked propriety, and here were the two set against each other, and it made him uneasy. And then, into all this, came Julian Thorne. He came up from London on the afternoon coach, in a fine coat and thin boots, and he took a room at the Aldermere Arms, as though the whole inn ought to feel honoured. Julian was the Duke's nephew, his brother's son, and with Edmund dead, Julian was heir presumptive to the whole estate. He had not troubled to visit his grieving uncle in 3 years. He came now, he said, to settle uncle's affairs. He said it to the innkeeper, who told the smith, who told the whole green by supper. And everyone understood what it meant, for men like Julian only ever mean one thing by it. He had come to sell Aldermere, to sell the hall and the timber and the land, and turn 200 years of stone into money he could spend on London tables. For the truth of the hall, hidden behind those closed shutters, was worse than madness. It was debt. Ambrose, in his grief, had let everything go. The letters had piled up on the hall table unopened, and among them, growing more urgent each quarter, were the letters from Harrogate and Finch, the bank at York, that held the mortgage on the estate. For the hall was mortgaged, as many great houses were, against loans taken in better years. And now the bank had lost its patience with a duke who would not answer. They had called the loan in. £6,000, the whole sum, to be paid within 60 days, or the estate would be seized and sold from under him. £6,000. A fortune. And the letters lay unopened in the dark, and the 60 days were already running, and the Duke did not know, or did not care, that the ground was going out from beneath his feet. Julian knew. Julian had made it his business to know. And Julian did not intend to save the hall. He intended to let it fall, and buy it cheap through a friend, and be rid of the whole grey ruin and his mad uncle together. It was Julian who found the bread. He walked up to the gates one morning to look over what would soon be his, and he found a warm loaf sitting on the gatepost in a white cloth, steaming in the cold. He picked it up. He turned it over in his soft hands, and when he learned from an old servant whose it was and how it came there, he laughed. A baker's widow, feeding the Duke, like a beggar feeds a stray. He thought it the most contemptible, ridiculous thing he had ever heard. And Julian Thorne was not a man who kept his contempt to himself. He got his chance to show it on a Sunday, at the churchyard wall, and it is the ugliest scene in this part of my story, so I will tell it plain. It was after morning service. The village had come out of St. Aldhelm's into a hard, bright autumn cold, and they lingered by the wall, as country people do, in 2s and 3s, to talk. 15 or more of them stood there, the Cobbs, the Pratts, the smith and his wife, Reverend Cade in his cassock, Eleanor among them in her good black, her hands folded, quiet. And a thing had happened that morning that no one could stop looking at. The Duke had come to church. Ambrose Thorne, 6th Duke of Aldermere, who had not been seen among living people in 3 years, had walked down from the hall and sat at the back of his own family's church, in the great box pew with the Aldermere arms carved on it, and he had sat through the whole service with his head bowed. No one had spoken to him, no one had dared, but everyone had seen. And now he stood a little apart from them all by the lich gate, grey and gaunt, in a black coat gone green at the seams, a ghost that had come halfway back into the world. Julian saw his moment. He saw his uncle standing there, and he saw the baker's widow, and he saw an audience of 15, and something small and cruel in him could not resist it. "Well," he said, loud enough for every soul at the wall to hear. He looked straight at Eleanor. He smiled. "There she is, the baker's widow. He let it hang. "Tell me, uncle, does she leave you a saucer of milk as well? For that is what this is it not? A woman of trade, feeding a duke at his own gate, like a stray." The talk at the wall died. Everyone went still. "A baker's widow, feeding the duke like a stray," Julian said again, savouring it, turning it for the crowd. "Have you no shame, woman? No sense at all of what you are and what he is? Have you no shame?" I want you to picture it. The cold churchyard, the 15 faces turned, the old duke by the gate, who had come out into the light for the first time in 3 years, and now stood frozen, hearing his nephew name aloud the very gulf that lay between himself and the one small kindness that had reached him. And in the middle of it, a widow in black with her basket, 48 years old, alone in the world, held up before her whole village to be laughed at. Eleanor did not weep. Understand that. Not one tear. She stood a moment, and the colour came up in her face, and then it went again, and she grew very still and very straight. She looked at Julian Thorne in his fine coat, and when she spoke, her voice was level, and it carried because the churchyard was so silent. "A hungry man should be fed," she said. "Duke or drover. It is no more than I'd do for any soul in this parish, and no less. There's no shame in a loaf of bread, sir." She paused. "If there's shame here this morning, it isn't mine." And then she picked up her basket, and she inclined her head to the vicar, and she walked out through the lich gate and down the lane toward home, alone, with her back straight as a young girl's. She did not hurry. She did not look at the duke. She simply walked home through the cold, and left the whole village standing at the wall with the truth laid bare in front of them. The gap between the two of them, yes, but her dignity too. They had all seen it now, and a good half of them were ashamed of their own tongues. The duke said nothing. He watched her go until she was out of sight. Then he turned and walked back up the ridge to his dark house and shut the gate. But something had been struck loose in him. You cannot stand and hear an innocent woman shamed on your account and go back to being a dead man. It does not let you. The shame of it worked in Ambrose Thorne all that week like a splinter. And so, on the 9th morning of the bread, the thing changed. Eleanor came up the ridge lane in the grey before dawn, as she had come 8 times before, the warm loaf against her arm. And when she reached the great iron gates of Aldermere, they were not chained. They stood open, a hand's breadth open, dragged back over the gravel. And in the gap between them, in the cold and the dark, stood the duke, waiting. Eleanor stopped. Her heart went hard against her ribs. She had never once meant to be seen. That was the whole grace of it, that he need never know her, need never thank her, need never bridge the gulf. And now here he stood, grey and enormous and silent, 3 feet from her, and there was nowhere to hide. Neither of them spoke. She could not find a word in all the world that fit. And he, it seemed, could not either. He only looked at her, a ruined face, deep-lined, with eyes that had wept themselves dry years ago. He looked at her, and then he looked at the loaf against her arm. Slowly, Eleanor held it out. The white cloth, the warm bread inside. And slowly, the Duke of Aldermere reached out both his hands and took it from her. He held it the way a man holds a thing he has forgotten the name of. And then he did a small thing that undid her more than any speech. He bowed his head to her, just an inch, a grave, small nod, from a duke to a baker's widow, in the cold at his own gate. A whole language in it. "Thank you. I know you. I am ashamed of what was said. I have nothing else to give you but this." Eleanor nodded back. And then, because there was nothing to say, and everything, she turned and walked home. But this time, halfway down the hill, she found that she was smiling, and she did not rightly know why. After that it was wordless for a good while, but it was no longer nothing. Each dawn the gate stood open, and each dawn he was there, or nearly there, and she gave him the loaf, and he took it and bowed his head. And then one morning, the empty cloth from the day before was waiting for her on the gatepost, where the loaf usually sat. He had returned it, not thrown down, folded into a careful square, corner to corner, by a man's clumsy hands, and set out for her to find. It was his only language, that folded cloth. He had no words yet, but he could fold a cloth and leave it as a reply, and she understood it as clearly as if he had written her a letter. "You came. I received it. Here is your cloth, folded, so that you know a person is on the other side of this gate, and not a ghost." She took to leaving the fresh loaf and taking the folded cloth, a small, silent trade at dawn, day after day, and neither of them said a word, and it was the warmest thing in either of their lives. But while the two of them found their slow, wordless peace at the gate, the 60 days were running down, and the world was closing in. Eleanor learned of it from the vicar. Reverend Cade came to the shop one wet afternoon, and over the counter, in a low, troubled voice, he told her what half the parish had begun to whisper, that the hall was mortgaged past saving, that the York Bank had called in £6,000, that there were but a few weeks left of the 60 days, and that Julian Thorne was not lifting a finger to save his uncle. Worse, that Julian was working quietly with a speculator to let the estate fall and snap it up cheap and turn the old man out of the only walls that still held his dead. The vicar told her because he did not know what else to do with the weight of it, and because he had seen, at the churchyard wall, that Eleanor Ashford was the one person in Nettlefold with the spine to hear a hard thing and not flinch. Eleanor heard it all. She weighed the flour in her hands and said little, but something settled in her, hard and certain, the way it had settled the morning she first saw him bareheaded in the rain, because she understood now what leaving bread on a gate could not fix. A man cannot fight for his house on an empty stomach, in a cold, dead kitchen, with no one to stand at his shoulder. A loaf at the gate was a kindness, but a kindness left at a gate is still a kindness kept at a distance. And distance, she saw at last, was the one thing that would let Ambrose Thorne lie down and die in the dark, while thieves carried his home away around him. So, Eleanor Ashford made a decision that a woman of her place was never meant to make. The next morning, she did not leave the loaf on the gatepost and walk away. She carried it through the open gate, up the long, weed-choked drive, past the dead fountain and the briared beds, to the great door of Aldermere Hall itself, that had not opened to a visitor in 3 years. She did not knock at the front. She went around, as servants go, to the kitchen door at the side. It was unlocked. Of course it was. There was no one left to lock it against. She pushed it open and stepped inside, uninvited, into the house of the Duke of Aldermere. The kitchen was vast and cold and gone to ruin. A great scrubbed table under 3 years of dust. Copper on the walls gone dull and green, and the range, the huge black cooking range that had once fed 40 at a sitting, standing cold and dead and choked with old ash, its fire out so long the very iron of it had the chill of a tomb. Eleanor Ashford set down her basket. She took off her shawl and hung it on a chair. She rolled her sleeves to the elbow the way she did in her own shop every dawn of her life. And she knelt down in front of that dead, cold range in a duke's kitchen where she had not been asked, and she began to rake out 3 years of ashes to light a fire. She had no leave to be there. She had no name that fit inside those walls. But she had 2 strong hands and a full basket, and the plain, unshakable knowledge that a house cannot be saved cold, and a man cannot be woken with bread left at a gate. So she cleared the grate, she laid the kindling, she found tinder in her apron and struck a light, and she coaxed a small flame up in the belly of that great dead iron, and fed it, and blew on it, until at last it caught, and held, and began, for the first time in 3 years, to warm the cold heart of Aldermere Hall. She set her flour on the table in a drift of white. She reached for the water, and she had just begun to work the dough with her knuckles, in the growing warmth, in the grey morning light through the dusty glass, when she heard it. A sound from deep in the silent house. A door. And then, slow and uneven on the stone stairs, coming down toward the strange, impossible smell of wood smoke and baking bread rising through his tomb, the footsteps of a man who had not come down to his own kitchen in 3 long years. The footsteps stopped in the doorway. Eleanor did not turn at once. She kept her hands in the dough. She had learned, in a long life of serving folk across a counter, that a frightened thing is best met sidelong. And the Duke of Aldermere, standing in the door of his own kitchen, was a frightened thing. She heard him breathe. She heard the small catch in it. Then she looked up. He was thinner than the man at the gate. In the grey light of the kitchen, she could see it plainer. His shirt hung on him. His hair had gone white at the sides. His eyes were the eyes of a man woken from a dream he did not wish to leave. He looked at the fire in the range. He looked at the flour on the table. He looked at her, a stranger, standing in the heart of his house with her sleeves rolled and her arms white to the elbow. "You lit it," he said. 2 words. Rusted. But words spoken aloud to a living soul. "I did," said Eleanor. "It wanted lighting." He came in slow. He put one hand on the back of a chair, as though the floor might not hold. His gaze went round the room, the copper gone green, the dust, the 3 years of it, and something moved across his face that was close to shame. "I told them not to come in here," he said. "After. I could not bear the sound of it. Pots, voices, her chair scraping." He stopped. "I told them to let it die." "A kitchen's not a thing you kill," said Eleanor. "It only waits." She turned back to the dough. She worked it. She let him stand there and be, the way you let a beaten dog come to the hearth in its own time. And after a while, without her asking, he lowered himself into the chair by the warming range, and he watched her hands, and the silence between them was not the silence of the tomb any longer. It was the silence of a kitchen with a fire in it, and someone at the board. She baked. The loaf rose and browned, and filled that dead-cold house with the one smell that no grief can quite shut out. And when it was done, she broke it, still hot, and set half in front of him on the great scrubbed table with her own 2 hands. He looked at it a long moment. "I have eaten this bread every morning for 2 months," he said, "off a cold gate, out of a cloth, alone." He raised his eyes. "I did not know I might eat it warm." "Now you know," said Eleanor. He ate. And an old man who had starved himself on purpose, who had thought that to feed his body was to betray his dead, put bread in his mouth in the light of a fire a widow had lit, and wept without covering his face. Not loud, just the tears running down into the grey stubble of his jaw while he chewed and swallowed and lived. Eleanor poured the tea. She had found the pot on its hook and scoured it and warmed it. She set a cup by him and one by her own place, and she sat down across the width of that table where 40 had once sat, the 2 of them alone, and they took tea in the cold kitchen of Aldermere Hall. That was the turning. Not the gate, not the folded cloth, the tea. She came the next morning, and she did not leave the loaf on the iron, she carried it in, and the range was cold again, for he did not know how to keep it, so she taught him. She showed him the raking of the ash, and the laying of the kindling and the coaxing of the flame. A duke, 3 years a widower, learning to light his own fire from a baker's widow, and glad of it. And slowly, over the grey mornings, he began to talk. He told her of Edmund, the son, 23, thrown from a horse on the Harrogate road, gone in the time it takes to fall. He told her how the boy had laughed, how he could not sit still in church, how he had wanted the army, and his father had said no, and now would give the whole estate to have said yes. He told her of Beatrice, his Duchess. 2 winters he had watched her go, an inch at a time, and there had been nothing in all his rank or all his money that could buy her one more spring. "I had a wife and a son and a house full of noise," he said one morning, staring into the fire. "And then I had none of it, and I could not see why the sun kept troubling to rise." Eleanor listened. She did not tell him her own dead. She did not hold up Thomas beside his losses and weigh them. She only listened, the way the deep well listens, and let him pour it in. She had learned that a grieving man does not want his grief matched, he wants it witnessed. "I was 2 years a widow before I could set one cup on the table of a morning," she said, at last, quiet. "I put 2 out still, some days. Habit. Then I put the one back." She looked at him. "It does not close over the hole. You only grow the rest of yourself around it." He said nothing, but he reached, and for a moment his hand lay over hers on the scrubbed board. An old hand, cold, and she did not draw hers away. The village saw. The village always sees. They saw the Duke of Aldermere walk down the ridge road one bright morning, upright, in a good coat, 3 years unworn, and stand in the doorway of the widow Ashford's bakery while she served her customers. He did not buy anything. He only stood and watched her work, and nodded to Sarah Cobb, who dropped the seeded plat clean out of her hands in her astonishment. And Mistress Pratt, whose knees would not carry her down the hill, was carried down it that very afternoon by 2 grandsons, so she might see with her own eyes whether it was true. It was true. The whispers changed their tune. What had been a scandal, a baker's widow trafficking with a duke, softened into something the village found it liked the taste of. They had watched a man be buried alive in his own house for 3 years. Now they watched him walk in the sun. And they were not fools. They knew who had dug him out. But there was one who did not soften. Julian Thorne had come north to bury an estate and pocket what fell off it. And now he watched his inheritance climb out of its grave, and he did not like it at all. He came to the hall. He found his uncle in the kitchen, of all the low places, in his shirt-sleeves, with flour on the table and a fire in the range, and the baker's widow gone home for the night. "So," said Julian in the doorway, "this is where you've got to." "Sit," said Ambrose. "There's bread." "I'll not sit in the scullery like a groom." Julian's eyes went round it, the fire, the warmth, the life of it, with plain contempt. "Uncle, the bank has called the debt, £6,000, and 60 days, and near half of them spent already, while you played at cottages with a tradeswoman. Harrogate and Finch will have this house whatever you feel about it. The only question left is whether we sell it clean and salvage something, or let them strip it to the walls." "We," said Ambrose. "I am your heir." "You are a man in a great hurry to bury me," said the Duke. "And I have noticed, Julian, that you were in that same hurry when I was already in the ground and did not care. I care now." He set down his cup. "Leave the letters with me. I'll read them myself." Julian's mouth thinned. He had planned for a broken old man. He had not planned for this one. "There is a gentleman in York," he said, careful now, "who would take the whole estate off our hands at once, no fuss, a fair figure." "A speculator," said Ambrose. "An investor." "And what does the parish get when your investor has it? The tenants turned off, the timber felled, the hall let go to rot or pulled down for the stone?" The Duke rose, and for a moment there was the old rank in him, cold and high. "My grandfather planted the beeches on that drive, Julian. I'll not sign them to a man who means to sell them for firewood so that you may keep rooms in London." Julian went white, then red. "You'll sign whatever the bank makes you sign," he said. 60 days, uncle, and you've a woman's apron strings wrapped so tight round your throat you cannot see it." And he went out, and the door of the great house shut behind him with a sound like a struck bell. Ambrose stood alone in the kitchen, and for the first time in 3 years he did not want to die. He wanted to fight. He did not yet know for what or how, but the wanting itself was new, and it frightened him more than the debt. He went that night, up the cold stairs, to the rooms he had kept shut, to Beatrice's things. He had meant to have them packed for the sale, boxed and carted so that no stranger's hand should pour them. He lit a candle. He opened the press. Her gown still hung there, keeping the shape of a body 3 years in the earth, her comb, her prayer book, and on the shelf among the household things, a small book bound in worn green cloth, her recipe book, the one she had kept in her own hand from the day she came to Aldermere, a bride. He took it down. He turned the pages by candlelight. Her writing, her small, firm writing, the puddings and the preserves and the physic for a winter cough, and the housekeeping of a great house, all set down in the hand of the girl he had married. And he turned a page and stopped. There, in Beatrice's own hand, brown ink faded soft with the years, was a receipt for a seeded plat loaf, the flour and the water, the seed pressed in along the braid, and a line beneath it, written to herself or to no one. Taught to the girls in the summer kitchen, that some good of my hand might go down into the village when I am gone. Ambrose Thorne sat down upon the floor of his dead wife's room, with the candle guttering and the book open on his knees, and he understood. The bread, every loaf, 2 months of loaves on his cold gate, the seeded plat, warm through the cloth in the freezing rain, that had been the first thing in 3 years to reach past the grief and touch him. It was hers. It was Beatrice's own bread, come back up the hill to his gate, in the hands of a woman he had let into his kitchen, and, God help him, into whatever was left of his heart. The dead had fed him. His wife had reached out of the ground with her own recipe and would not let him starve. He wept then, as he had not wept even at the burying, and out of that weeping terribly came not gratitude but fear. For he saw in one stroke how far he had let himself go toward the living, and he saw the years on him, and the grave he was digging himself out of, and he thought, I am an old man, and I am about to ruin a good woman's last good years by tying them to a dying house and a mourning fool. So he did the cruelest kind thing a frightened man can do. He resolved to send her away for her own sake. He went down in the morning. She was there at the table, the fire already lit, her hands in the flour, and she looked up and smiled at him, and the smile near unmade him. I found something, he said. His voice was wrong. She heard it and went still. Ambrose? The recipe, the seeded plat. He set the green book on the table between them, open to the page. It was my wife's, Beatrice's. She taught it in the summer kitchen, to the girls in service. He looked at her. You were one of them. One summer, said Eleanor, very quiet, I was a girl. A great lady came down to the kitchen and stood at my shoulder and showed me the braiding of it. And she was kind to me, kinder than a duchess need be to a baker's girl. I never knew her name would come to mean so much. I have baked her bread every day of my life since, and never known whose loss it was I carried down to your gate. For a moment his face was open, and she truly thought, that here was the thing that bound them, that the dead woman had joined their hands. But he closed it. She watched him close it. Eleanor, he said, I am 48 years a duke, and near 60 a man, and I am burying a wife and a son and a house all at once. You have given me back my life. I'll not repay you by spending yours. He drew a breath, and it shook, and out of it came the 7 quiet words she would remember to the end of her days. Were I 10 years younger, you'd be my Duchess. The kitchen was very still. But I am an old man beside a grave, he went on, hurrying now, not daring to stop, and I'll not chain your best years to it. You've a shop, and a life, and a chance yet at some plain, honest man your own age who can give you morning after morning, not a ruin on a hill with 60 days to live. Go home, Eleanor, and thank you, for all of it thank you, but do not come again. She stood a long moment. She did not weep. She had not wept at the churchyard wall when Julian shamed her before 15 souls, and she did not weep now. You are a coward, Ambrose Thorne, she said without heat, and I say it because I have never lied to you, and I'll not start at the door. You call it kindness. It is fear wearing kindness like a good coat. You'd rather send me off than risk one more grave. She untied her apron. She folded it. She set it on the great scrubbed table by the green book. I'll not chase a man who won't be caught. But you're wrong about the years. You'll see it too late, most like. Men like you always do. She took her basket. She took her shawl. She left the apron folded on the table, next to his dead wife's hand, and she walked out through the open gate and down the ridge road for the last time. And she did not look back, because if she had looked back, she would have broken, and she would not give the whole cold house the satisfaction. No loaf came to the gate the next dawn, nor the next. The range at Aldermere went cold. Ambrose let it. He told himself it was right. He told himself she was better off. He sat in the dark of the house and heard the silence come creeping back into it, room by room. The silence he had thought he wanted, and found he hated it now, for he knew at last exactly what it had cost to break. On the third night he could not sleep, and he took up the green book again, only to be near her hand. And he turned the pages he had not finished turning. And near the back, in the margin of a page for a plain seed cake, he found more of her writing. A later hand, shakier. Written, he knew by the look of it, in the last winter, when she was already going. Ambrose reads over my shoulder as I write, and frowns, and says I mustn't tire. Foolish man. When I am gone, he will make this house a tomb. I know him. He will sit in the dark and call it faithfulness. Do not, my love. A house should never go quiet after me. Light the fires, fill it. I did not spend my life warming these rooms so that you might let them freeze in my name. If some good soul comes to your gate, open it. I will not be waiting at any door you refuse to walk through. The candle burned down. Ambrose Thorne read it 3 times, and 4, and then he put his face in his hands, and this time when he wept, it was not grief, it was release. The dead woman had reached up out of the earth a second time, and with her own hand had given the living leave to live. Foolish man, he said aloud, to the empty room, and it was her voice he heard say it. Foolish, foolish man. He rose before dawn. He did not know yet how he would win her back, or whether he could, but he knew he was done being buried. And a man who means to live again must first keep the roof over his head. He met the letters, all of them. He sat at the hall table where they had piled unopened for 3 years, and he read every one, and he did his sums. £6,000, weeks now, not months. He would not sell the estate whole to any speculator. But there was timber on the far ridge his grandfather had let stand for 80 years, and there was stock, and there was silver in the house he had no heirs to eat off. He sent for the honest agent from Harrogate, not the sharp one from York. He sold the timber fairly, he sold the stock, he sold the plate that fed nobody, and he raised, coin by honest coin, the money to pay the bank and keep the beeches standing and the tenants on their land. And while he did it, Julian moved to strike. The nephew had not waited. He had gone to the speculator in York, and believing his uncle broken, had drawn up the papers himself to sell Aldermere over the old man's head the moment the debt fell due, with a quiet clause that turned a tidy private sum into Julian's own pocket for the arranging of it. Self-dealing. The heir selling the estate cheap to a friend and taking a cut for the treachery. But Nettlefold is a small place, and a small place has long ears. It was Reverend Cade who heard it first, from the speculator's own clerk, who had a cousin in the parish and no love for his master. And it was the village, the same village that had murmured at the churchyard wall, that closed round the thing like a hand. They had watched Eleanor Ashford stand straight while she was shamed. They had watched her dig a duke out of his grave, and they would not stand by and see his own blood rob him in his weakness. On the day the bank's agent came up from York to see the estate settled, they were ready. The agent sat in the hall's cold dining room, and Julian sat beside him, all smiles with his papers, and the Duke came in grey and quiet, and the Reverend Cade came in behind him with 3 villagers and the speculator's own clerk. "Before any hand touches any pen," said the vicar, in his mild way, "there is a matter the bank should hear." And the clerk, twisting his hat, told it. The private clause, the cut, the sum Julian had written for himself into the sale of his uncle's home. The room went very quiet. Ambrose looked at his nephew across the table for a long moment. He did not shout. He had done 3 years before with shouting. "You told me," said the Duke, slow, "that you wished the hall to have a future. I have thought about that, Julian, and I find you were right." He rose. "It has one. It simply hasn't got you in it." The bank's agent gathered his papers with cold haste. He had come to settle a debt with a broken man. He found the debt already met, in honest coin, and the heir a self-dealing cheat, and he wanted no part of the second thing. He confirmed the mortgage paid. He tipped his hat to the Duke. He would not so much as look at Julian. Julian Thorne left Nettlefold on the London coach that same afternoon. He had come to bury an estate. He left having buried only himself, and the village lined the street to watch him go, not with jeers, for they were decent folk, but with a silence far worse than jeering. And that was the last the Ridge Road saw of him. The estate was saved, not by a speculator, not by a fire sale, but by a man who had chosen, at 58, to climb out of his own grave and fight for his life. The beeches stood, the tenants kept their land, and the range at Aldermere waited, cold, for someone to light it. But there was no one to light it, for he had sent her away. The harvest fair came to the village green in the last warm week of the year. The whole of Nettlefold turned out for it, the stalls and the fiddle and the tables of pies. And Eleanor Ashford was there with her basket, for a baker does not stop baking because her heart is sore. She stood at her table in the sun and sold her loaves, straight-backed. And if she was thinner and quieter than the summer, only Sarah Cobb marked it, and Sarah said nothing. The green was full. The same 15 who had stood at the churchyard wall were there, and Mistress Pratt in a chair, and Reverend Cade, and the wives who had murmured, and a returned figure at the edge, for Julian had not been the only one to hear the fair was on. The whole parish had come. And then the crowd stirred, and turned, and went quiet. For the Duke of Aldermere was crossing the green in the full light of day. He came in his good coat, upright, white at the temples, and he carried in his own 2 hands a loaf, a seeded plat, warm, for the smell of it went before him. He did not send it up on a cart, he did not leave it on a cold gate, he carried it himself through the whole watching village to the widow's table. Eleanor stood very still. "Eleanor Ashford," said Ambrose, and his voice did not shake now, for he had done with being afraid. "I said to you once that were I 10 years younger, you'd be my Duchess. I was a fool and a coward, and you told me so, and you were right." A ripple went through the crowd. He did not heed it. "I have thought long on my years since, and here is what I have come to. An old house on the edge of its last chapter does not need a young bride to grace it. It needs the right woman to see it safely into the next hands, with a warm range and an open door and children on the drive. It needs a woman who can bury the dead with honor and still feed the living." He held out the loaf. "My age is not the reason I should not ask you. It is the very reason I must. I have not so many mornings left that I can spend one more of them without you across the table." His voice dropped, and the whole green leaned to hear it. "I need you, Eleanor. Not the shop, not the bread. You. Be my Duchess. Come and light my fire, and let me spend what's left growing old beside the woman who taught me I was still alive." The green held its breath. Eleanor Ashford looked at the loaf. She looked at the man holding it, 60 near enough, grey, upright, unafraid at last. And she took the bread from his hands, warm, in the sunlight, before the whole of Nettlefold. "You took your time," she said. And the village that had whispered at the churchyard wall broke into a cheer that startled the birds up off the church tower and did not stop for a long while. Reverend Cade beamed until his old face near cracked. The 2 wives who had murmured, "Have you no shame?" dabbed at their eyes and swore afterward they had rooted for the match from the very first loaf, which was a lie, and nobody minded it. Sarah Cobb wept openly. Mistress Pratt banged her stick on the ground and cried out that it was about time, and the whole green laughed and cheered the harder. They were wed at St. Aldhelm's before the leaves were down. On the morning of the wedding, before the bells, Eleanor went into the kitchen of Aldermere Hall, that she had lit with her own hands on the day she chose him. She took down the small green book, Beatrice's book, and she set it open on the shelf, in the light of the window, to the page of the seeded plat. And Ambrose came and stood beside her, and he laid his old hand over hers upon the page, over the writing of the wife he had loved and lost. "Thank you," he said, not to Eleanor, to the book, to the woman who had sent her bread up the hill to his gate and would not let him die. "Thank you, my love." The dead woman was not erased that morning. She was thanked. She had opened the door herself and walked them both through it, and now she could rest. 1 year on, the range at Aldermere burned every dawn. The shutters that had been shut 3 years stood open to the light. The copper on the walls was scoured bright again, and of a morning the village children came up the long drive under the grandfather's beeches, for they had learned that the Duchess of Aldermere baked with her own 2 hands, and would give a warm roll to any child with clean fingers and a please. For she was Duchess now, Eleanor Ashford that was, and she wore it as plainly as she had worn her baker's apron, and she kneaded her own dough every dawn of her life as she always had, for she had never learned another way to be useful, and she never wished to. On Sundays, the 2 of them walked down to the churchyard together, an old man and his late-come wife, arm in arm, with 1 basket between them, and in the basket 1 loaf, a seeded plat. They tended 3 graves, side by side. Thomas Ashford, baker of Nettlefold, 26 years. Beatrice, Duchess of Aldermere. And Edmund, 23, thrown from a horse on the Harrogate road. 2 households made into one. 3 dead, tended by 2 hands that had learned that love does not end at a graveside. It only changes what it carries. And at the last, before they turned for home, Eleanor would break the loaf and leave the pieces on the wall for the birds, as she had once left a whole loaf on a cold iron gate for a man she thought would never open it. Some seasons of the heart open late. Ask any widow of 48 who lit a fire in a dead man's kitchen. They open late and against all sense, and they open widest of all. Comment the town you're watching from and tell me, how far do you think Eleanor's bread has travelled by now?